Hello, and welcome everyone to this past webinar in partnership with Dell Technologies. We're excited you could join us today for Michael Guthrie and Doug Bernhardt's session, SQL Server 2019 and Containerization, Considerations for a Changing World. This session will be recorded and posted online after the event. You will receive an email letting you know when the recording becomes available. My name is Janice Gerbrandt, and I have a few introductory slides before I hand the reins over to Michael and Doug. Our next PASS Marathon BI edition will take place on December 11th, starting at 1600 UTC. Stay tuned for when registrations open mid-November. Remember that PASS Summit 2019 will be happening on November 5th in Seattle, Washington. Head over to pass.org and register today. If you require technical assistance, please type your request into the question pane located on the right side of your screen and someone will assist you. This question pane is also where you may ask any questions throughout the presentation. Feel free to enter your questions at any time, and once we get to the Q&A portion, I'll read your questions aloud to Michael and Doug. You are able to zoom in on the presentation content by using the Zoom button located on the top of the presentation window. Please note that there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session, which will pop up after this session ends in your web browser. Your feedback is really important to us for future events, so please take a moment to complete this. This session is co-presented by Michael Guthrie and Doug Bernhardt. Michael is the messaging head at Dell EMC for both Oracle and Microsoft SQL high-value workloads. In his over 10 years at Dell EMC, he has held roles in solutions, sales engineering, and product management. Doug has over 25 years experience working with SQL Server in various roles and works with customers at various points in the sales and support cycle to educate them about integration of SQL Server with Dell EMC storage. And without further ado, here is Michael and Doug with SQL Server 2019 and Containerization.
Good afternoon, everyone, or morning. For some of those folks. And thank you for attending our webinar on SQL 2019 and containerization. Today, Doug and I are going to talk and walk you through some of the new implications around data management and application development and how that's driving containerization in enterprises. We will then discuss the primary considerations for architecting and deploying a foundational infrastructure for containerization and some discussions on big data clusters with Kubernetes, new from Microsoft, including some availability and protection strategies and integration of containerization applications with persistent storage from, of course, Dell EMC. So first of all, now as I engage with customers and partners across our customer ecosystem about Microsoft solutions, an incremental awareness of the idea of data has kind of dawned, and how data is accessed and leveraged has become evident. There's been kind of a foundational shift around that data which has occurred. And what I've found is we're now kind of living in a new era of data management, but many of us were not aware of this change was developing. This kind of crept up on us without the fanfare you might see from a new technology launch. And when you take a step back and look at these shifts in its entirety, you see these changes, just aren't isolated updates, but instead are amplifying their benefits within each other. There's a fundamental transformation in the industry, similar to when the virtualization revolution was first adopted about 15 years ago. And for many, this change started to become apparent with the end of the support of SQL Server 2008, earlier this year, along with the support for all previous versions of the product. This deadline, coupled with the large install base that still exists on this platform, is helping this conversation along. But it's not just to replace the old with the new in a point-by-point swap out. The doors opened in this new era to force a completely different view and approach. So we no longer need to have a SQL, Oracle, SAP, or Hadoop conversation. Instead, it becomes a holistic data point of view. In our hybrid multi-cloud world, there is not just one answer for managing data. Regardless of the types of data or where it resides, with all the diverse data languages and methods to control data, the word data can encompass a lot. The global changes around technology, including IoT, 5G, AI, ML, all these acronyms are generating more data and more types of data. So how can we access that data and derive insight from it? That becomes critical. But we have been limited by people, processes, and technology, and specifically technology enabling the ability to dramatically enhance the way databases are repurposed and how data is addressed. Your business probably can easily change the process to leverage that technology. So as a DBA or a system admin, you need to create new processes to use new tools and technologies when repurposing databases. Business processes need to be reviewed regarding production and non-production database isolation requirements, and hybrid realities will likely drive you towards consumption models that best address business needs. So what is occurring is incredibly impactful for how customers like you should view and treat data. There are three key areas that we will examine with the new paradigm today as we get into the containerization and big data clusters concepts. And we'll start with this concept of data gravity. Data gravity is the idea that data has weight. Wherever data is created, it tends to remain. Data stores are getting so big that moving data around is becoming expensive, time constrained, and database performance impacting. This in turn results in silos of data by location and type. You probably know this from your own experiences. Versioning, a lack of upgrade or migration or consolidation of databases also perpetuates these silos. Data gravity does not mean on-premises versus cloud. Cloud is an idea or an operating model, not a location. All it means to probably you and to us is that you bring the analytics and the applications to the data, either on-premises, cloud, or hybrid, or whatever makes sense. But businesses, like you, don't just want to store data. They want to use it regardless of where it resides. This is the concept behind what we call data virtualization or data democratization. The ability to allow all the people access to all the data, within reason, of course. Data virtualization allows you to access the data where the data is stored without a massive ETL event. You can see and control the data regardless of language, version, or location. And the idea is that data remains where it is, but you have a real-time source access to this data. You can access data from remote or diverse sources and perform actions on that data from one common point of view. So outlining a strategy in this new era of data virtualization and abstraction requires a shift from how we approach management. So it's not a one-size-fits-all strategy by any means. These concepts are definitely, they require a holistic approach to data management and the path to get there. And so to modernize your SQL Server and large data estate requires different thinking and a holistic approach along with getting to this SQL 2019 paradigm. So there are many paths towards modernizing the data estate across all these different use cases that you probably find familiar. We find that our customers are looking to Dell and our partners to help guide them through these changes and to solution things that will meet their needs while laying the foundation for what they will need tomorrow. So together we want to outline the modernization strategies for you and consider and help you consider in this new era what you can do and help guide you through that journey. So specifically, what does digital transformation mean? So while everyone's path is different to this future data state, as illustrated here, most share some common objectives. These include sustaining older versions of SQL Server deployments, including the applications that ride on top of them, while migrating to SQL Server 2019, and ultimately enabling virtual data access and management, leveraging containers, big data clusters, and hybrid cloud services. Let's look at some of these strategies and stages. Okay, we'll do that here. The typical business today, as you see on the left, is running hundreds of applications and supporting multiple databases and mixed workloads, OLTP, OLAP, and the like. Consolidation strategies must take into consideration ensuring the availability and performance of business-critical applications. The introduction of faster, more powerful servers from companies like Dell EMC and storage technologies to boot is making it possible for businesses like yours to consolidate databases without traditional associated risks. So consolidating and simplifying mixed workloads running on Microsoft SQL siloed IT environments will not only lower TCO and increase productivity, but establish a modern infrastructure ready for the future data state. Companies are looking for more choices of development language, data types, and OSs in order to unlock the value from their data state and maximize its value. So replatforming SQL Server to Linux or mixed Windows Linux platforms will open doors to greater flexibility. And as it pertains to data integration, containerization and analysis ultimately. There are also potential cost benefits, including licensing, training time, and hardware costs that you can take advantage of. And containerization ultimately provides a very flexible platform for even the most complex application and databases and development around them. Containerization of SQL Server empowers companies like yours to deploy updates and upgrades on the fly and with probability or portability to build locally deployed to the cloud and run anywhere. So you need to develop a roadmap and deployment strategy for moving to Microsoft SQL Server 2019. And again, it's not just upgrading to a new version. Depending on the as-is state that you might be in and the state you want to get to along this paradigm, planning includes profiling and assessments for applications and SQL Server data stores to prioritize projects like upgrades, application-centric agile migrations, and potential replatforming as well. With a modern data management platform from Microsoft and Dell EMC in place, data infrastructure services, IT, will be ready to support this business with IT services for new data-driven intelligent applications. So I've been dancing around the containerization topic, and that's where I think most of you want to get to. First of all, probably most of you may or may not know about containerizations. So let's have a quick definition about what it is. So what is a container? Simply put, it's a method of running virtual hardware where a single host operating system supports multiple processes that are running as virtual applications. So essentially, operating system virtualization. Contrast that with the older and more common virtualization method that many of you are probably familiar with, hardware virtualization or virtual machines, VMs, used by platforms such as the usual suspects: IBM VM, VMware ESX, and Microsoft Hyper-V. And this kind of virtualization starts with the hypervisor layer that abstracts the physical components of the computer. Obviously, this abstraction enables sharing of the components by multiple VMs, each running a guest operating system. With containers, but container-based virtualization, the combination of the guest operating system components and any isolated software application constitutes a container running on the host server. This allows abstraction beyond virtualization, and it runs just about anywhere. Data becomes nimble, and you can move it around where needed. And it's really amazing how pervasive containers have become in such a short time. It's no longer a science experiment like it was maybe 4 years ago or so, but it's quickly becoming the new normal. In the past, many customers had a forklift perception that when a new technology comes into play, it requires a lift and replace. I've heard, what am I going to do? What am I doing today is no longer good, so I have to replace it with whatever your new product is, and it will be painful. But I've been using the phrase that containerization enables all the things. Containerization has been adopted by so many architectures that it's easier to talk about where you can't do it versus where you can. So traditional SAN, converged, hyperconverged, hybrid cloud, you can place this just about anywhere. So you can run containerized applications on any of those underlying technologies. It's not just one right. There's not just one right path. Do what makes sense for you guys, and it becomes a holistic solution. So there are multiple ways to address the business need that customers have, even if it's leveraging existing designs that they've been using for years. We at Dell Technologies have published details of several architectures supporting SQL Server and have just recently published the first of many papers on SQL Server and containers, which Doug will certainly get into and we can certainly share with the folks on this webinar. So containerized databases. So digital transformation has always been a driving force for evolving relational databases into the next generation of data management platforms. Microsoft has been expanding its software offerings to include support for a broader range of operating systems, including Red Hat Linux and SUSE Linux, and programming languages like R and Python. And this has paved the way for Microsoft to offer SQL Server on Docker containers, which we're going to get into in a little more detail here. Microsoft first introduced SQL Server containers on Linux with the release of SQL Server 2017, which many of you probably know, and they're expanding these capabilities with SQL Server 2019 with the big data cluster. In SQL Server 2019, Microsoft will make it even easier to adopt SQL Server and containers by enabling a new high availability scenarios, HA scenarios, Linux-based container images on Microsoft Container Registry, Red Hat certified container images, and the SQL Server operator for Kubernetes, which again, we'll talk a little bit more about later on in this webinar. You can use these SQL Server operator for Kubernetes, and it makes it easier to deploy availability groups in Microsoft. So whether customers are looking to use containers for test and development purposes, which most people are doing, like DevOps, or to deploy databases with container orchestrators such as Kubernetes, SQL Server in containers ensures a consistent, isolated, and reliable behavior across environments. That's easy to use, and it's easy to start and stop. Customized content can be built on top of SQL Server containers and run without being affected by the rest of the environment. This isolation makes SQL Server in containers ideal for the test deployment scenarios, as well as, like I said, DevOps. And Dell EMC brings, the power of our persistent storage platform to this stateless platform that is containerization. Dell EMC storage and a CSI plugins that we're going to talk about later too enable container orchestrators like Kubernetes to easily provision highly available and scalable container volumes for stateful containerized applications and databases. So combining the statelessness of containers with the statefulness or the consistent images of the database itself. So for application developers, you can leverage the advantage of Docker, Kubernetes, Microsoft SQL Server, and Dell EMC storage all in one, for instance, along with the servers and networking to improve the efficiency of your production database environments and the DevOps that support them. And this will shorten time to value for all your new application development, or we hope it will. So now I'm going to turn it over to Doug, who's going to get into a little more details about the big data clusters, Kubernetes, and Microsoft SQL Server 2019.
Thanks, Mike. So now that Mike's given you an overview of containers and what they're all about, let's take a look at an example of our favorite product here, SQL Server inside of containers.
Hey, Doug.
So
Doug, can I interrupt? Can you change your display? We're seeing your notes.
Oh, sorry.
No worries.
You're seeing all the top secret stuff.
Yep. All the secret sauce.
All right, there we are.
Thanks.
So let's take a look at an example here now. One of the great things about containers, and same is true with deploying SQL Server in containers, is the simplicity. So they're extremely lightweight and can be pulled down from a public repository and literally deployed with a single command. And so to deploy and start an instance of SQL Server inside of containers, you literally run a sudo docker run command here, and meaning we're executing the Docker container as a super user, and as part of this command, we're passing in some parameters here. So DE is an environment variable, and we're telling it to accept the EULA, and we're setting a password, and then the -P is redirecting the default network port of 1433 to port 1401. So not only does this increase security by not running SQL Server on the default port, but it allows us to run multiple instances if we wish. Then we're going to move on to the -V parameter, and the -V is a volume bind parameter, meaning that we're going to mount the local volume home Doug SQL files as var-op MS SQL inside the container. So this provides persistent storage to our container, a principle that we'll talk about a little bit later. The -name is meaning that we're going to run this container as a SQL1 container. And then the -D means we're going to run this container image within in the background, and we're going to go ahead and start this instance. And so once this instance starts, then we can connect to it on port 1433, and we can manage it just like any other container instance. Now to stop this instance and stop the container, we just simply run a sudo docker stop command with SQL1, which is the name of our container. And then finally, if we want to clean this up, then we run the sudo docker rm command to remove the container and clean up this environment. So now that everyone's up to speed and we're all experts on how to deploy SQL Server inside containers, let's expand a little bit on our knowledge of SQL Server and containers and talk about the big story here with SQL Server 2019, which is big data clusters. So the Microsoft story here is that they've created a platform to connect all of your data, whether that be relational data within SQL Server or even Oracle, or NoSQL data sources or data sources like Hadoop. So they're enabling you to use tools like SQL that you probably already know and love, as well as other powerful analytics tools such as Apache Spark. And you can do this in a single pane of glass with Azure Data Studio. So instead of building a big data environment and then figuring out how to scale it later, the ability to build and deploy a scalable cluster is built in from the beginning. From day one, you will build and deploy a multi-node cluster. SQL Server 2019 Big Data Clusters simplify the deployment of big data environments tremendously. So in the past, you've had to install these database instances and then a Hadoop cluster, configure Spark, all these things had to be installed and configured separately. So with SQL 2019, a simplified deployment scenario has been created. So it's worth noting here that in case you're wondering, this is a separate product of sorts from the traditional SQL Server on Windows or even SQL Server on Linux. So while there's an instance of SQL Server that's going to be deployed as part of the cluster, it's installed with a different set of tools and it's a completely different installation experience than SQL Server on Windows. So to clarify, this is a separate product that shares a common component, a SQL Server instance. This is not replacing the existing SQL Server product that we've all grown to love. So with that, I would say we're entering a brave new world here. With SQL Server 2019 Big Data Clusters, because coming from what I would call a traditional SQL Server background, meaning that I kind of cut my teeth on SQL Server on Windows, even before running SQL Server on Linux, when I first heard about this concept of big data clusters, I was literally blown away. To me, this sounded like the biggest fundamental shift in SQL Server that in my 20+ years experience with the product that I had ever seen. So this goes way beyond embracing open source. This is jumping headfirst into the deep end. So when I heard about this, I thought I have to see what this is all about. In my role at Dell EMC, I was able to participate in the Microsoft SQL Server 2019 Early Adoption Program and take a look and see what this was all about. And I can honestly say that it's turned out to be a journey unlike no other I've taken with SQL Server at this point. So first we have containers, and we've already talked about this a little bit. And then we're going to use Docker as our container engine to run our containers. And we've gotten a taste of that, and I even showed you how to run SQL Server on Docker. Now we introduce Kubernetes, and I'm not going to be able to turn you into a Kubernetes expert in the remaining time we have here. But for now, just understand that Kubernetes is an orchestration engine. It's what will power a big data cluster and provide the container orchestration and scheduling across multiple nodes. So in this new world, containers and Kubernetes are Linux-based. So when you deploy a big data cluster, you'll notice that the stack is made up of lots of different tools and products. And there's no setup.exe here, folks. So while the deployment has been made very simple, you're going to need to get used to working with the command line, at least for now. So my advice to you is get comfortable being uncomfortable. For those of us who are long-term SQL Server fans, we've been working with a very stable, very mature product. Sure, it's had its share of exciting features and tremendous scalability enhancements, but these things were largely built on familiar concepts. So if you're coming from SQL Server on Windows especially, this is going to feel a lot like the Wild Wild West. The landscape is changing fast. Documentation can be sparse. So it's all moving fast and it's very exciting times. So let's get to it. But before we do, I believe we have a couple polling questions here for the audience.
The polls actually have been up already.
Okay, so perfect.
Carry on.
So this is an overall architecture diagram of SQL Server 2019 big data clusters deployed on Kubernetes. And there's a whole lot going on here. So let's break this diagram down a little bit. So we've got this thing up here in the upper right, applications, and this looks familiar to us coming from SQL Server. Now we've added a SQL Server master instance, and we've got some other SQL Server instances down there, some storage over here on the left. Okay, so far so good. Now we've got a new item up here, this control plane, and there's all kinds of different boxes in there of stuff. Proxy, Kibana, Elasticsearch that are a little unfamiliar. And we add in a compute pool and an application pool of multiple instances. And now we're wrapping a data pool around our storage, and then a storage pool which consists of Spark and HDFS. And then finally, we're going to wrap this in a Kubernetes pod and Kubernetes nodes down here at the bottom. So there's a lot going on here. But luckily, Microsoft has helped us out a lot with this. So what did Microsoft do with this whole new architecture? Lots of different things. But first of all, the components that we saw have been placed inside containers. So we talked about SQL Server deployed in containers earlier. Now with big data clusters, we have the components of an entire data lake essentially being containerized and included in this single product. Next, they chose Kubernetes as a platform. And so once again, Kubernetes, or K8s, if you want to be cool, is an orchestration platform for containers. So it allows for management, scaling, and deployment, among other things, of containers across a cluster of hosts. And then finally, they provided a handful of wonderful tools for the deployment and management of big data clusters. So if we look at the deployment from a high level, and we really greatly oversimplify this for a moment, there's really only three things we need to do. We're going to deploy Kubernetes, then we're going to deploy our big data cluster on top of that, and then finally we'll get to enjoy our SQL Server 2019 goodness. So when we deploy Kubernetes, what Microsoft tells us is that how we deploy it is our choice. Because once you deploy it, it works essentially the same and provides the same functionality. So how we deploy it is up to us. Deploying in the cloud, you will likely use something like Azure Kubernetes Service or something similar, and you feed it some sizing parameters for the cluster, and it does its cloud magic, and you have a brand new cluster. There's lots of different reasons why you would want to deploy on-prem. The cloud versus on-prem discussion is much larger than what we have time to cover here today, but our focus today is on-prem, so we can learn about what's going on with this thing. If you're coming from a traditional SQL on Windows background, this is the part that you'll probably find the most daunting, and we'll get into a little bit more about that in a minute. But essentially, you're going to be installing an OS, likely Linux, installing some flavor of Kubernetes, and then configuring and provisioning storage. And then we deploy a SQL Server big data cluster on top of this, and our great friends at Microsoft had made this part pretty easy. So it's not quite setup.exe easy, but with a new command line utility called AZData and a couple modifications to a JSON file or two, you can deploy all those little boxes that we were looking at earlier. Microsoft is taking all those and packaged them up into neat little pods and containers and given us a command line tool to deploy the whole thing, which seems pretty darn cool. So finally, when you get that all done, you'll have a nice SQL Server 2019 big data cluster of your own, so you can experience all this goodness for yourself. So this graphic on the right is from the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and it depicts an overview of the current Kubernetes landscape. So as you can see, there's a ton going on here in terms of different deployment platforms. We're going to use vanilla Kubernetes for our examples here today, but you can go with one of the 58 different distribution platforms on-prem, one of the 40 certified hosted platforms. So you're not only choosing where it's deployed and what it's deployed on, you're also choosing the tool set for management and deployment. So there's lots of different options here and lots of different decisions that you have to make around this. So let's recap a little bit on some container principles and start to talk about storage, because there's some key points here, and this is where we at Dell EMC can help out. So containers are ephemeral or short-lived, meaning that if they die, you just spin up another and you're back in business. And when they do die, their storage is recreated. So at this point, if your storage for your database is inside of a container and you don't provision some type of persistent storage, what happens if the container dies and is recreated? Well, it's bye-bye database. So in 2018, somebody wisely decided in the Kubernetes community that it's a good idea to keep data. And so that's when the concept of persistent storage was born. So it's important to understand the difference between container storage and persistent volumes. Coming from a database background, we all assume storage is persistent, and in Kubernetes, it's a special type. So to summarize, the storage in Kubernetes is ephemeral. If you deploy SQL Server as a container and you create a database or store a database into it without presenting external storage, when you restart the container, you're going to lose that data. Persistent storage in Kubernetes is referring to storage that's configured for the cluster and then presented to a pod. That storage ultimately appears as a folder within a container running within the pod. So what's important to know here is that you need to make special accommodations for storage when you're working with databases and big data clusters. So let's talk a little bit more about persistent storage. For a single host, you can just present a local volume, and that's what I did in the Docker container example earlier. There's no concern for sharing because it's only one host. When you get into multiple hosts, that's a different story. So anyone having experience with Windows Server failover clustering and SQL Server failover clustering is familiar and probably remembers the concept of shared storage on SAN volumes. So we're dealing with a similar concept here, multiple hosts or nodes in Kubernetes that can have access and need to have access, but ownership needs to be managed and controlled. Not everyone can be allowed to write the same location at the same time. So the original way to do this in Kubernetes was with the cloud provider, which was called in-tree, meaning that vendors had to contribute to Kubernetes source to support persistent storage. The new way to do this is through Container Storage Interface, or CSI plugin. Not only does the CSI plugin allow for cleaner integration, it also provides new and expanded features such as volume snapshots and volume cloning. So to get into this a little bit more, I'll hand it back to Mike, and he can explain a little bit more about the CSI.
All right, thank you, Doug. So yeah, as Doug was talking about a little bit about the Kubernetes CSI specification, it was developed as a standard for exposing arbitrary block and file storage systems to containerize workloads through an orchestration layer. Prior to that, as Doug was alluding to, it was very difficult for vendors to actually integrate with that because they have to align themselves with Kubernetes release structure or release schedule, and make things like that happen before they could do it. So it was so you were always kind of a little bit behind. So it was a powerful plugin and everything like that, but now before the adoption, again, we had adding support for new volume plugins. It was very, very difficult. So we as Dell EMC, we wanted to add support for their storage system to Kubernetes. The fixing was very difficult. So now what we can do is we can use the CSI plugin to actually expose the storage quickly and easily. And sorry, it's not flipping. So the adoption of the CI specification makes the volume layer truly extensible. So using it, we can now write and deploy plugins to expose new storage systems in Kubernetes without ever having to touch the core Kubernetes code. And this makes it easier for you, the customer. So now you can do all the different storage options and make the system even more secure and reliable and take advantage of all of the different value add and data services that storage has underneath it. So for example, in the case of PowerMax, if any of you folks are familiar with PowerMax storage arrays and things of that nature, you have SnapVX functionality or data services in there that allow you to create volumes and consistency groups in there to support databases and transactionally consistent databases, which is critical for SQL Server databases. So now you can expose those snapshotting and technologies inside of Kubernetes and to the containerized application, so you don't lose the data. You can take a snapshot of a PowerMax volume through Kubernetes and through the application, and then if you want to create a copy of that or destroy the container or containerize application and bring it back up, you can then quickly and easily through Kubernetes and the CSI plugin bring it back to that stated application. So Gold Master database development, for instance, can be easily handled with Kubernetes and containerization and an advanced storage array or storage subsystem from Dell EMC. So currently, we at Dell EMC, we have CSI plugin support for our PowerMax arrays, for our VX Flex OS, which is on our hyperconverged VX Flex platforms, and of course Extreme IO as well, and with new ones arriving all the time. And all that's available on the GitHub, and we're going to announce more at PASS next month, or actually it's next week now in 2019. So, you know, we've with the CSI plugin, Kubernetes has given vendors the ability to expose our data services and our advanced data services. And I just pointed out the snapshotting and cloning capabilities, but there's also high availability underneath, disaster recovery technologies, backup, all that thing that is exposed by the storage array underneath can be exposed and used in containerized applications via Kubernetes. So bringing it all together, we have our SQL Big Data Cluster with SQL Server 2019, multiple different data sources, SQL 2019, our SQL Server databases, HDFS, and the ability to expose advanced data services from advanced storage subsystems from Dell EMC in particular, to be able to have the complete application development production support environment. So I'll talk a little bit, I'll hand this back to Doug. We'll talk a little bit about some documentation that you can avail yourself of. Doug?
Sure. So now that you've gotten a background on Kubernetes and CSI, it's time to deploy our SQL 2019 Big Data Cluster. So first, you're going to install and configure Kubernetes. Microsoft has done a great job of this, and they have some great documentation using vanilla Kubernetes. So you can learn all about it here from the link above. And then when you get to the point where you've configured Kubernetes and you're ready to install and deploy your big data cluster, you're going to install the Dell EMC CSI plugin. Our plugins can be found on GitHub in the Dell folder. And as Mike just mentioned, all the platforms that are currently supported. In addition to that, we're going to be announcing additional platform support at PASS Summit and Microsoft Ignite. And then going forward, as new support becomes available, you'll be able to find that support once again on GitHub, just in the Dell folder. And then once you have your plugin installed and your storage provisioned, then you can follow the Microsoft SQL Server Big Data Cluster deployment guidance at the link here to deploy your 2019 Big Data Cluster. And at a point in there, it's either going to prompt you or you can enter it into a configuration file, the storage class name that the Big Data Cluster is going to use to persist all your storage onto. And so that's where you would enter the storage class that you created and that you configured with your CSI plugin. So we've been working hard here at Dell EMC to enable customers for the SQL Server 2019 release and big data clusters. Come see us at PASS Summit to learn some more about this. We've got a lot of stuff going on here. Kicking off the main conference on Wednesday morning, I will be presenting a SQL Server 2019 and big data clusters on Dell EMC storage breakfast session. So you can come there, get some good breakfast, and then learn more about our storage integration with 2019 and big data clusters. And then later that day, in the evening, we're going to have a exhibitor reception that PASS holds in the exhibit hall. So you can come there. For those of you who enjoy a tasty treat of barley and hops in liquid form, come see us, and I think we can hook you up. And then on Thursday morning, my colleagues are going to be presenting a session, another breakfast session on data protection solutions for Microsoft SQL applications. After the breakfast session, of course, there'll be the keynote, which you'll want to attend at Past Summit. Immediately after the keynote, I'll be presenting a technical session on deploying SQL Server 2019 big data clusters on VMware. And so I'll get into a lot more of the details and actually walk through how you would set that up and how you would deploy it on VMware and what your options are there. So, and then finally, all week long, come see us at the Dell Technologies booth in the exhibition hall. I'll be there on and off. I've got some booth duty in there, and so when I'm not attending sessions myself or presenting a session, you'll be able to find me some hours there in the booth. So stop by with any questions that you may have around SQL Server 2019 and containers and Dell integration with those, and we'll try to hook you up. And just a little pro tip for Past Summit this year. If you want breakfast, you're going to want to sign up for a vendor session there in the morning. So with that, I will turn it back to our moderator for some wrap up and some questions.
Great, thanks, Doug. So looking back through the questions, and some of them came in early in the session, so the questions may have been somewhat answered, but so maybe we can treat this like review. Is there a way to keep the same container when it reboots? This is one of the reasons we're still using VMs.
To keep the same container. So what happens upon a reboot? So back to the whole principle about containers are ephemeral. So the container will stay, the definition will stay, the container will be created. So I assume in this case, you're talking about like the node that it's running on reboots. That will be created, and then it'll essentially, so like from a SQL perspective, if you had persistent storage configured properly, it'll just kind of look like a cluster failover. So your data will be persisted if your storage is configured externally, but it's gonna go away, and then it's gonna come back.
Okay. Somebody had a question about I think it was the install script for Docker. Why were there 2 dashes for name?
So that's a syntax thing. So if it's like 2 dashes and you can give it the full parameter name, or just 1 dash and you give it a letter, an abbreviation for the parameter.
Okay. Another question, how can containers spin up so quickly? Is it that the underlying infrastructure is already there, but the deploy carves up a container for you?
Yeah, so I mean, the whole architecture is a little bit more than what I can get into, but the containers are essentially a lightweight version almost of like a mini OS. And so there's a lot less provisioning that has to happen within there, even though you can like log into them and things like that, like a VM. So they're just a lighter weight, essentially version of a VM that still has the abstraction.
Yeah, so pieces of the OS that are germane or applicable to the application itself are the things that constitute the container. The other basic things, networking processes and things like that, may or may not, or are part of the Docker container or the enveloper of the container itself. So that's why they go fast. So it's just less to turn up, if you will, in a container.
Okay, another question. How are multiple containers on the same host differentiated as far as their connection strings?
So from a SQL Server perspective, you would manage that with the port number. So you would connect to the IP of the instance or the host, and then in the example that I showed, like for example, the default port of 1433 was redirected to a different port. And so that allows you to run multiple instances on the same host because they're listening on different ports.
Okay, thank you. Another question, what is a pod?
So a pod is a Kubernetes concept It's basically a grouping of multiple containers that allows them to share resources. So if you have containers that say need to share storage or communicate back and forth and need to be moved around together, so like you need them on the same node, it's basically a way to couple them together and allow them to share resources.
So integrated applications that need to work together or need to exist together in a logical fashion, most usually. They can be managed as pods together, so Kubernetes can manage them together and bring them up and down together.
Okay. Is CSI a Dell-only plugin, or is it open source?
So the CSI specification is provided by Kubernetes to allow vendors to write to it. So we adhere to the CSI specification, and we create a piece of code that you can install that can then communicate to our subsystem. So any vendor could do that if they wanted to. The CSI specification is open in that regard. So I guess the specification is provided by Kubernetes. Doug, do you want to elaborate on that?
No, I mean, I think that's a pretty good overview. So it's just a standard API that they publish. They keep updating that with different capabilities in the different versions, and then it's up to the vendors in terms of what capabilities within that specification they want to implement.
Yeah, so anybody who's installing Kubernetes would also, if they wanted to use the Dell EMC PowerMax storage as part of their implementation, they would install that, and that would allow you to communicate with the PowerMax array, for instance, and all the networking underneath that connects to it in the SAN. And they could put any number of different plugins on their Kubernetes infrastructure if they wanted to. So if they have multiple storage subsystems. So if you were also at a hyper-converged solution from Dell EMC like VxFlex, you could install both of those on there, and they could integrate both storage subsystems, or even other third-party vendors as well.
Okay. Another question, how is the CSI stack more high availability than a traditional SAN? This person notes that the SAN is often the single point of failure. For example, one SAN goes down and you lose your database storage.
So, well, I mean, what you're doing by utilizing a SAN, for instance, or a hyper-converged solution, if you're not using that, is you are taking advantage, and it's the implementation of what you're doing with that storage subsystem, and whether you're implementing backup cloning snapshots under that or some kind of DR solution using the array itself. So if you don't do that, then of course you're going to have a single point of failure at the storage subsystem. So you have to you would want to implement those strategies as well in your array to take advantage and to be truly to have true high availability, especially for your data. These are concepts and solutions that we've had in place at Dell EMC for a long time. We've had, in the case of PowerMax, for instance, we've had our SRDF solution for data protection and disaster recovery solutions underneath. So if you have that implemented and you have your Kubernetes availing itself or using the PowerMax production storage, you'd have DR for the storage itself, and then you have Kubernetes managing the containerization of the dev test or production data on there. So yes, to answer your question, it wouldn't be HA unless you actually implemented the HA solutions or the disaster recovery solutions, and you'd have to do that. And we can certainly help you with that. We've been doing that for 30 years. That's our expertise in that area for sure.
Yeah, to expand on that a little bit, the CSI, the interface itself isn't doing anything. It's just coordinating the events, right? So it's just a standard interface that vendors can use to say, okay, mount a volume, dismount a volume, perform a snapshot, those types of things. So the CSI in and of itself doesn't
refresh a snapshot. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it doesn't protect anything for you. It just allows you to work with your different storage devices in Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is all the containerization stuff free to use?
So there's a lot of different stuff around that. So like the examples that I use, the examples that Microsoft uses, yes, from, to try it out. Now, from a SQL perspective, I'm sure they'll be talking about like how the licensing and all that stuff is going to use. But from an operating standpoint, when you walk through their install instructions to deploy this on-prem, they'll use Ubuntu as an OS. And so that's free to use. We have our plugins out there, and then you can, download those and install those, and those are free to use. And so, I guess the big question, that remains is around SQL Server and how the licensing is going to work and that kind of stuff. But for the rest of the stack, yeah, you could implement a purely open source stack to run your SQL 2019 big data clusters on. And certainly you can implement an open source Kubernetes stack.
Yeah, but most customers, and I mean, it's the same concept with Linux. I mean, certainly Linux in itself is open source, but if you want to get support and you want an enterprise solution, you would have to pay a company like Red Hat, for instance, to actually provide that support. And it's kind of the same with Dockers and versus Docker and Docker Enterprise, for instance, and Kubernetes and the Enterprise Kubernetes implementation too. So free to use and free to try out, definitely. But more sophisticated and you want implementations that are protected and reduce risk. You're going to want to evaluate your options about licensing and what enterprise level features you need and are willing to pay for. So,
Is it possible to use CentOS? I'm probably not saying that right. As a base container, or am I stuck with Ubuntu?
No, you can certainly use CentOS.
Okay.
And so I've actually,
got that right.
You've been using it in the labs and things like that. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Lots of questions here.
These are great questions, by the way.
Okay. Yeah. Somebody is asking whether big data cluster on Azure Kubernetes service, has it been tried?
Has it been tried?
Or what are the issues?
My focus has been on-prem, but I think a lot of the examples and demos that I've seen from Microsoft, and I'm sure a lot of the ones that you'll see at Ignite and Past Summit will probably be AKS based.
Yeah, I don't think there's a technical reason why it can't be done. So, right, Doug?
Yeah, and when you walk through the big data cluster documentation, that's in there as one of the common examples.
Yep.
So I would say most of the people just kicking the tires on it, that's probably what they're starting with, because it's extremely simple to do, as long as you have your account, your Azure account and things like that. So.
Okay. How easy is it to transfer a database from SQL 2017 Microsoft to 2019 Linux?
Back up and restore.
Okay.
Yep.
That was easy.
Yeah.
Is there a virtual trust platform module for containers, VTPM?
Good question. I don't know about that one. Mike, do you know?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, but we'll take a note about that, and Doug and I will find an answer. And if you're at PASS, you can ask him. Or if you're at Ignite, I'll have the answer there, because I'll be at Ignite.
Good job stumping the presenters, by the way.
Okay.
Nice job, yes. 15 for 16 right now.
Do you get Windows authentication support when you run SQL Server in containers?
So I know there's AD support and things like that in 2019 big data clusters. I'm not entirely sure. Mike, do you know about the rest of the product suite?
No, I mean, I'd have to get that one too. So, Janice, you have that? Did you write that one down? We have it on recording. I'll pull it out of the recording. We can do a follow-up on those two questions. Yeah, absolutely.
Somebody's asking whether there's support for RHEL, and I don't know what that is.
Red Hat Enterprise Linux? Yes.
Yes? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think there's any, I don't think any of the primary Linux flavors are not supported. I think you can use them all. CentOS, Red Hat.
Yeah, and there's actually been a lot from Microsoft on examples on RHEL.
Okay. Is anybody using containers for database replication between containers? Are there issues with that?
Replication.
I'm not familiar with too many. You know, usually, so most of the use cases that we've seen so far, at least personally, and you know, Mike can chime in as well here, but it's mainly been like DevOps type stuff. You know, where you're building out like deployments and things like that. When you start getting into, you know, production level stuff and you know, data replication scenarios and things like that, I don't know that it's quite as common yet. It'll probably become more common, you know, with big data clusters and the stuff that's going around with that. But obviously, that's a brand new product and it's not out yet. So,
yeah, it's a good question. I mean, you can, you know, the person who asked the question, it's definitely seeing some of the possibilities there. I can't imagine why you wouldn't do it. I mean, maybe it could be a question of designing your host and network physical resource to be able to support, you know, the extra load and you know, some of the other protection strategies around that to make sure that you're doing it right. I mean, I think most of the customers that we deal with, again, we're Dell EMC, so you know, our background is, you know, big SANs, hyperconverged infrastructure, storage solutions, server solutions, things like that. So, you know, in those kind of scenarios, we would default to our tried and true technologies underneath, which is why we think the CSI plugin and being able to do things on the storage level with containerization is so cool. It allows customers who are currently doing all the replication and snapshotting and DR and backup and protection strategies in there at their storage and server layers or their hyperconverged layers now to be able to quickly and easily get into containerization and do the DevOps stuff. To marry what they're doing with the, you know, in microservices architecture and containerization with what they're doing at the enterprise level with their data and their applications on the data. So that's really the big use case we're seeing right now. I'm sure we'll get there, like Doug said, you know, as people, you know, kick the tires on the big data clusters and all the different things you can do and all the different vendors that are out there creating new and cool things to be able to do and containerize applications with Kubernetes.
Okay. Can we squeeze one more in before we're done?
Sure, go for it.
Sure.
Okay. There are more questions, but I think we will have to stop the recording soon. The questions will go to Dell, and perhaps you could address some of them next week at Summit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can we leverage this containerization just to streamline SQL Server deployment? That is traditional SQL databases without the big data cluster element?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, so you could, I mean, if you just want to do single instance, you know, single host type stuff, the Docker deployment makes it, you know, super easy. I mean, I kind of understand where you're coming from there. There's a lot of customers, and I know when I was a DBA, you have a lot of commodity SQL instances that maybe don't support a high performance application. They're just, you know, data store for this or configuration information or whatever the case may be. And so, yeah, that's really, you know, one of the design goals was to make it like super simple to deploy and super easy to to manage, and so you can just deploy these instances easily.
Okay. Eric is telling me we've got time for a few more questions. When is this going general availability?
So if you're talking about SQL Server 18, to my knowledge, an official date has not been announced yet. But if you're familiar with Microsoft, you'd probably want to pay attention at Ignite and PASS, because when they have big shows, they like to make announcements. Yep. That would just be my guess.
So you're suggesting perhaps next week is a good time to pay attention?
Yes, I would have my ears open next week.
Okay. Does the use of persistent memory affect the operation of the containers? Have you personally done any container implementations using data center persistent memory?
I haven't. I don't know. Have you gotten into this, Mike?
No.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of people trying it. There's a lot of people using it in dev and test and things like that. But in terms of like a lot of hardcore production type uses, I haven't seen a lot of those yet. And quite frankly, we haven't seen a whole lot of in-memory stuff too. Those have been kind of edge cases, has been my experience.
Yeah, I certainly think that's going to change. We have a lot of big enterprise customers, a lot of big commercial customers, and everybody in between. And if you think that some of the more advanced customers might be looking at that at the dev perspective, and kicking the tires on it. But a lot, I'll be honest, like 40% of our customers are still trying to get 2008 upgrade. Yeah. So, and a little secret there, right? So, we're trying to sketch out what you can do with containerization and how we're making it easier to use your persistent storage layer in your operations. Eventually, I think we're going to get there where some of these applications are going to be, we're going to be able to support. We're going to see customers doing more within memory things. We're already seeing folks with, with the HANA, with SAP, and even trying to containerize those things for the guys who support SAP. But yeah, I think we'll see it. We just, we're helping our customers. We're helping our customers move into their, just get the middle tier of your legacy transformation thing that you probably saw earlier going, consolidating, getting rid of the silos, getting ready for containerization so that you can do all this cool, multi-data analysis stuff going with your applications.
Okay, probably one more. Can we achieve the same thing whether deploying SQL 2019 on AKS or on-prem Kubernetes? Any limitations that we need to be aware of and cost implications? So use Docker or Kubernetes for containerization SQL 19.
Wow, that's a super big question.
We're gonna have to do we're gonna have to get our services guys in there and do a complete TCO analysis of your requirements. I'm sorry, go ahead, Doug.
So here's what I'll do. I'll pull the classic SQL Server answer for all those SQL Server people out there. It depends.
It's also an Oracle answer, by the way, and an SAP answer. Yeah, certainly technology doesn't preclude you from that, but there's a lot of things to think about when you're doing that. I guess if you have security, I'll go back to the beginning of the presentation, the data gravity and the data gravity thing. Whether you want to do it on-prem, a mixture, a hybrid, where are you going to do it is a very good question from a cost perspective. But when you're thinking about it, it's about security and it's about cost, those two things. And then probably third is latency. Can you actually support it? Can you actually do what you need to do on-prem or in the cloud or wherever you're going to be doing it? So, those are considerations that our services guys make when they're evaluating where and how we're going to do things and where the implementation is going to go. And really, that's beyond just Kubernetes and containerization. it's the consideration for everything people are doing with IT now, not just how they do DevOps, for instance. So yeah, it depends. I wish I had a better answer, but you can certainly look at what you're trying to do and take that lens on it and help you make that decision. I mean, we're Dell Technologies. We sell hardware and software and solutions. You know, we do really well when customers want to put stuff on site, but you know, we're in the business of helping customers do the best thing that they can for their business. So where they put it, we can help them make those right decisions and make sure the data is in the right place so that it can be used for its main purpose.
And a lot of the times too, I mean, I'll add that these decisions kind of come down to what else is going on with the rest of your organization, right? Because your SQL Server environment is certainly important, and a lot of times it's the most important, but it's all the other applications, it's all the other things that we're connecting to. And with big data clusters, you know, we're really talking about building this, you know, scale out single pane of glass where you're going to want, you know, good connectivity and everything like that to all these different data sources. And so, you know, where are the rest of these things going to live, right? Not just what do you want to do with SQL Server, and where do you want that to live?
Okay. So just so you two are aware, there are lots of thank yous coming in from the audience. People are really appreciating your time and the presentation.
Well,
so we could probably advance to the thank you slide.
Did I do it? I just pressed it. Oh, there we go. All right, well, thanks for attending, everybody. We really appreciate the involvement and a lot of great questions too. And like we alluded to earlier or said earlier, Doug's going to be a big presence at SQL Pass this year. He's got his presentations, his deep dive into the configuration, and maybe actually looking at how we do it and how we implement it, Kubernetes and the big data clusters, and some of the containerization concepts that we just went over. We'll answer a lot of your questions. I'll be at Ignite. So we'll have Doug, the technical person at Pass, and me, the portfolio manager marketing type at Ignite. So stop by, say hi. If you have more questions, we'd be more than happy to answer them and point you in the right direction. If we can't get those answered for you on site, we'll certainly get them answered for you later. So thank you all for attending, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.